Have you ever played Monopoly with either your friends or family and heard these words coming out of someone's other than yours mouth?
Ha! And that's another Monopoly.
The rage and anger or disappointment you feel hasn't been just part of the game. Don't you want to stop the political corruptions these monopolies cause on a day to day basis, just like Robert Lafollette? Well, watch this. So, what was political corruption? Well, it could be summed up as a bunch of old, fat, white men who use their business and influence of political seats to use power for their own benefit.
Oftentimes, these corporations would run political machines to secure votes. The political machines would also prevent laws that dismantled their own businesses, and it didn't matter if it was legal or legal. They would bribe officials so that laws, such as laws that would dismantle the business, as mentioned before, were more generous and forgiving towards those specific individuals who had the companies. Finally, they would use tactics such as voter suppression to ensure that people with opposing ideologies wouldn't have a say in who was elected for governor or mayors of towns or states. The ways that they would suppress votes ranged from scare tactics to bribery to poll taxes and literacy tests.
What were the consequences political corruption brought? Well, the monopolies formed through trust put those running on top. The trusts that formed through monopolies wouldn't be affected by laws due to those specific legislations. The comparison of robber barons from the Middle Ages was fairly accurate and commonly brought about because of the greed formed in monopolies as it continued to grow along with their power. The conditions for the bigger masses were often terrible, especially for any type of worker that wasn't on top of the monopoly. Even then, the law wasn't preventing these conditions.
Some of the laws, acts, and court cases that changed and fought political corruption were the Sherman Antitrust Act, which outlawed trusts and other monopolies that fix prices and restrain trade. The Interstate Commerce Commission and the Interstate Commerce Act, which got rid of the laissez faire way of thinking and that the government would finally step in to oversee trade. The National Child Labor Committee and Keaton-Owing Act of 1916. The National Child Labor Committee was formed to out the harsh labor conditions that children were forced to work in. The Keaton-Owing Act prohibited the transportation across state lines of goods produced with child labor. Finally, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which created the program of the Federal Meat Inspection.
So, what were the effects of the laws and acts put into place? For the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, small businesses were somewhat safer from being taken over from monopolies. For the State Tenement House Act of 1901, lives in tenement houses became just a little better with new regulated construction. And for the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, major railroad companies' power to set unfair rates was taken away.
The Keaton-Owing Act of 1916 contributed to the fight for better working conditions and restrictions of child labor. And lastly, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, in which the food industry was put under a spotlight and they started making more attempts to keep the food in safer conditions than before.
What was done about the greed and corruption of these political policymakers? Well, some politicians who opposed the corruption and political machines would make laws and acts that actually sympathized for the betterment of the public. One such politician was Robert Lafayette, who was very vocal and strongly opposed corruption of political machines. But who was this Robert Lafayette? Well, he was a Wisconsin governor, and as I mentioned before, he strongly opposed political corruption and political machines and actively sought out to get rid of them. He went to and graduated from the University of Wisconsin, where he met his wife, Belle Case. In 1891, he became a public enemy of political machines and political bosses when he announced that Follete Sawyer had often offered him a bribe to sway a court case. And finally, he served as the governor of Wisconsin from January 4th, 1906 to June 18th, 1925.
So, what did Lafayette do? In state reform, he proposed the Wisconsin idea, in which he believed that an efficient government should be controlled by the voters rather than business leaders. He also believed that there should be regulated public utilities. He took on the powerful railroad industry, and he adopted tax reforms. For political reform, he introduced the initiative, a bill originated by the people rather than lawmakers, the referendum, which was a vote on the initiative, and the recall, which enabled voters to remove public officials from elected positions by forcing them to face another election before the end of their term. More political reformities that were made, however, not influenced by Lafayette, was the Australian and secret ballot, which allowed voters to mark their choice for office secretly, the direct primary, which were nominations for candidates placed into the hands of voters, and finally, and most importantly, was the 17th Amendment, in which rather than the state legislators, voters would directly vote for the US senators.
Alright. Clearly, monopolies still exist in this day and age. While they aren't complete monopolies, these companies have such a firm grasp on the markets that they dominate that entering competition is utterly pointless. These corporations run what's known as a natural monopoly, and they supply all of the goods for their market with little to no competition. This means that they can control prices, and when they can control prices, they become greedy, driving up prices with little financial consequence. A good example of this is Apple with the new iPhone 12. They're charging $699 for the worst model of the iPhone 12 and $1,099 for the best. On top of that, it doesn't come with a charger, which means you'd have to pay for it separately, although it is a necessity for the phone. Even though these massive corporations make billions of dollars a year, they highly underpay their workers. In fact, they don't give them a living wage. Additionally, the CEOs and the companies as a whole make billions of dollars each year. Despite making so much money, they highly underpay their workers. In fact, they barely give them a living wage. For example, Amazon. This company gives long working hours, little breaks, and harsh working conditions and stress. They manage to get away with it with their clever marketing and monopoly over delivery, but the fact of the matter is that these people are overworked and underpaid for the work that they do. Because of these horrible, long, terrible hours that the workers have to deal with, as well as their very, very minimal wages, their work is comparable to the work and wages of the people living prior to the Progressive Era.